Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. Well, the sun's shining, the hummingbirds are fighting, the songbirds are singing, and the bugs are biting. And I tell you what, folks, that can mean only one thing. It is Dragoon Week. I know a lot of y'all have been excited about this, and so have I. So let's get started. Now, why are we doing this, first of all? A Dragoon Week, a whole week about Dragoons. That seems a little crazy. What is a Dragoon even? Well, that's a good question. And in fact, that question is so common and there's so many misconceptions about what Dragoons are and what they aren't, as well as people who just never really understood the definition or even heard the term before. This is really important because Dragoons are very similar to the most common Mosin, the 9130 rifle, and you've probably seen one. I mean, most people, let's face it, have seen a rifle just like this guy right here. In fact, a lot of people, including myself, got their start on rifles just like this one. These were the ones that back in the day you could get for like $50 at your local hardware store or something like that. Really, really cheap, really, really cool. They made these by the millions. But the Dragoon is this thing's lesser-known cousin, and quite frankly, the Dragoons are a lot more valuable from a monetary standpoint, and also provide a very interesting value from a historical standpoint. Now, what we're not going to do is say that Dragoons are more historically significant than the 9130 rifles here, but what we are going to say is that they're historically very different rifles in many ways. And this is a big disappointment because a lot of the interesting history with Mosins comes well before these 9130 rifles came around. They came about when a lot of these Dragoons were floating around the earth being used by various armies, including the Russians. These are very, very similar looking rifles. Dragoons are basically the same length for all intents and purposes as your normal 9130 rifle. They can use the same stock. The stocks can be interchangeable with 9130 rifles. The handguards can be interchangeable a lot of the time as well. The barrel bands can be interchangeable. The bolts can be interchangeable. All of the parts like the magazine and everything else can be interchangeable. Even the cleaning rods can be interchangeable. And really, technically, the front sights could be interchangeable as well. So really, what is even the difference between a Dragoon rifle and a 9130 rifle? That's a good question. And our first episode here this week, there's so much things to talk about, right, when we talk about Dragoons. What I want to do for our first episode is just focus on exactly some definitions, looking at what is a Dragoon, and then we're going to look at some of the differences here between the 9130 rifle and look at what these rifles first looked like when they came around in 1893. Later on in some more episodes coming this week, we're going to be looking at more Dragoon rifles, which I know y'all will be excited about, but we're also going to be looking and focusing on actual real-world historical use cases, different types of people that use Dragoon rifles. But again, there's so much information, I don't want to overload it all into one episode, so we're really focusing on just looking at an example and figuring out what Dragoons are, how they're different, and what exactly these things looked like. And how old are they? That's another good question. Well, like I said, Dragoons first came around in 1893. 1893, at the time of this episode, 1893 is about 129 years ago. That's really, really old. Can't stress that enough, right? It's interesting to think about how Mosins we think of as sort of wouldn't say a modern gun, but a sort of gun that's at least very usable in modern society. Modern ammo works in them. I could go buy ammo for one of these and take it to the range. Whether it be a 1942 9130 rifle like this or, well, an 1893 Dragoon rifle. That's pretty wild. That's just one of the interesting things about these rifles. Okay, So what we're going to do now, before I go on too many more weird tangents and rabbit holes, is we're going to take a closer look at this rifle to help us understand the difference between a Dragoon and a 9130 rifle. And then we're going to talk about what these look like exactly when they were incepted in 1893. So let's get to it. Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to want to take a look at is the rear sight. This is the main differentiation between a Dragoon and a 9130 rifle. This is the first thing you look at to tell if the thing you're looking at is a 9130 rifle, a Dragoon rifle, or maybe even something else. So we're all familiar with this 9130 rifle right here, right? We've got this tangent style rear sight. It's got this slider and these two buttons you press and it slides up or down like that. Really simple, all right? This is the standard 9130 rear sight. And we see this one has this interesting sight base. Some of these are pinned on here. Some of them aren't pinned and just have silver solder, but they all have a sight base that looks like this guy right here, okay? And we can see this, it's affixed to the base with this cross pin, and then we have these two humps on each side of the sight base that kind of keep it stable. Make sure there's minimal sight wobble, all right? Dragoon rifles are a little bit different. What is going on here? Well, this is actually the old style Mosin Nagant sight base. This is the same sight base that was used across M91 rifles through World War I. This sight base was used on M91 rifles, which of course was the standard Russian infantry rifle in 1891 all the way to World War I. It was still standard issue. They would have had a sight base just like this. All this sight base is, it's a dovetail on the barrel, and then it'll be silver soldered on. There's no cross pins like we saw on the other one. That's just the way all of these were done. And what's interesting is the Dragoons and the Cossack rifles also shared the same type of sight base, and we can see here. Now you see this one has all these numbers. We're not going to talk so much about that today because this was actually put on here by Finland much later than when this gun was produced. We're going to talk about that in another episode here, but for now we're going to ignore this and focus just on this sight base in conjunction with this rear sight. This is the Kanovalov rear sight, okay? We can see it's also affixed by a cross pin, but this sight base is a different design where it doesn't really do as good of a job of holding in the rear sight, and thus you can get, this one's actually pretty good, but you can get a lot of wobble on these, just sort of a byproduct of that, but they can still be plenty accurate. It's really about the shooter a lot of the time at least. And again, this rear sight, the Kanovalov rear sight, and when we say Kanovalov rear sight, I'm talking about this part, not the sight base, just this rear sight here, this assembly. This was also used on Cossack rifles and the M91 rifle during World War I and up. But the thing is here, this is not the original rear sight for a Dragoon rifle, okay? Dragoon rifles used an older style rear sight even than this when they came about in 1893. Now, before we look at that, who actually made Dragoon rifles? Well, we know that for our 9130 rifles here, generally these were made, you'll see them either made by the Ijevsk factory, which is who made this guy. We can see that by this triangle and an arrow right there. So this is an Ijevsk, or Tula, which generally will have a big star on the barrel shank. So two manufacturers. Well, sort of the same thing for Dragoons, except they were instead mostly just Ijevsk rifles. Up until World War I, the only company that produced Dragoon rifles was the Ijevsk factory. So you can sort of think of Ijevsk when you think Dragoon rifles, but as we're going to see in a future episode, not always. But most of the time when you see a Dragoon rifle, it's going to be an Ijevsk rifle. Now, if we look at the markings on this guy, this is our first one of the week we'll be looking at. This guy is cool. This is actually an Ijevsk, so that's just like we said, that's what we would expect. This guy was produced in 1895.
with a hex-style receiver, which is what we would expect because the hex receivers were made up until around 1935-ish, around there. So that makes sense. And we've got our Imperial crest there, put there also by probably someone at the Ijev's factory. Again, we've got our crest there. And for those wondering what this says in Russian, this says, up here, this word is Ijevsk. And then below it, it says Oruzheny, which is weapons. And then Zavat, right there, which is factory. So Ijevsk Weapons Factory. So this is a pretty early one on in the production. These Ijevs started producing the Dragoon rifle in 1893. And this one's in 1895. So this one's pretty old. Okay, now before we talk about a lot more, I'm going to take a step back, and you'll notice that this one, like the 9130 rifle, has the escutcheons right here. See these metal escutcheons in the stock? Has them up here too. Okay, now, this piece you can ignore because that also has to do with Finland, which we'll talk about in a future episode. But we're back in 1893, okay? This would come around the 1930s probably, so that's much later. Back in 1893, this gun would have had these escutcheons initially, which is interesting because back in 1893, the M91 rifles did not have the escutcheons. That's because the slings on those rifles didn't even go through the stock. Those guys had a little swivel on the magazine rivet. There would have been a swivel as part of this rivet where the sling would have attached, and then there would have been no escutcheon on the front of an M91 rifle, and on the barrel band on the front of an M91 rifle would have had a sling swivel on the bottom of it. But the Dragoons weren't like that, okay? The Dragoons look like this, which is really where the 9130 we see, even though this one has later type escutcheons, would sort of keep this design. But where does this design come from? Well, actually, interestingly enough, this design where you have a shorter carbine version of the infantry rifle, because again, a Dragoon rifle is a shorter carbine version of the M91 long rifle. Well, before this guy came around, we had the Berdan II, and the Berdan II did not have these escutcheons. It was basically like I just described with the M91 rifle with that weird sling swivel setup. The Berdan II Dragoon rifles, though, had this escutcheon right here. And they also had these same type of barrel band springs. See these springs in the stock? M91 rifles didn't have that either. But this whole design with these springs that we see on this Dragoon rifle, as well as our modern day 9130 rifle, actually, modern day comparatively, I guess, actually come from the Berdan II Dragoon rifle, which we'll have to look at another day. But I just wanted to mention that because it's interesting where we see the lineage of something like that, and it's even present through the Dragoon rifle all the way to our cool 9130 rifle there. Okay, so that's that guy out of the way. Now, in 1893, though, this would have had the escutcheons, but it would not have had this thing right here. See that? This is a recoil lug. And this was added after the implementation of the Spitzer cartridge, which was also known as the Model 1908 cartridge. It wasn't at the same time, it came a little bit later. This was sort of an afterthought because when the Spitzer cartridge came around, it had a really nice, obviously, Spitzer-shaped bullet instead of the old bottlenose projectile that would have been used when this particular gun was released in 1895, and of course when it originally was around in 1893. So a big bottlenose cartridge. Didn't have a recoil lug, right? You would have just had this finger groove in the stock, and it would have just looked like this up here, right? Basically just no recoil lug. This came later because with the adaptation of the Spitzer cartridge, it had a much higher velocity, and as such, they ended up starting to crack the stocks, and then they realized, this is a problem. We need a metal insert here to brace the bottom of the receiver up against when we're shooting so it doesn't fly into the stock repeatedly and then crack it over time. So would not have had that originally. Now, the handguard's another interesting thing. This one's an early type handguard, but this is not the original style handguard. Interesting enough. What I'm going to do now is flip this guy around, and I can give you a better idea of what it is we're talking about here. Alrighty. So see on this side right here, we have our original sight graduations, but they're crossed out. Okay, originally there would have been no sight graduations on this particular rifle. Okay, now why is that? Well, this is where Dragoons get really weird. When this gun came out in 1890, well, this particular one was produced in 1895, it had a much weirder handguard. So the handguard at the top actually split here and broke off into two separate pieces and then joined back up back here again. So it had this big hollow piece in the middle where, of course, the sight base was. So basically it was a wood handguard that wrapped all the way around the rear sight on both sides. And on this side, in the wood handguard itself, they actually engraved the sight graduations. That's pretty strange, isn't it? Why would they have done that? I don't know. That's one of those things where they probably thought, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Unfortunately, though, that, especially by the time of the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians figured out that that was a really fragile style of handguard. And that's a problem because if it breaks, then if you have really untrained troops, your sight graduations are now gone because they were stamped onto or burned into the actual wood of the handguard itself. That's a big problem. So on some Dragoons, you'll actually see on the left-hand side here, these older ones, they re-stamped the numbers. So this is not even original to the gun. So originally this had that weird handguard, and then later that handguard was removed and replaced with this style handguard, with these little brass tabs and rivets here on the sides. When that was done, the Russians decided to stamp in Artians the sight graduations here on the side, okay? That's what we see, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Now, it's very typical to see that on basically all M91 rifles from like the World War I era and before, but sometimes Dragoon rifles, you won't actually see these sight graduations. And that's probably because they originally didn't have them, and then they were just never replaced by anybody. They were never stamped. So this one's actually gone through 3 different sight graduations. It originally had them on the handguard, then Russia re-stamped them later on the sight itself, and then of course Finland, which we'll talk about later, re-stamped the sight graduations in meters on the right-hand side. Okay. So now we understand the sight graduation thing. So remember, again, some Dragoons, you won't see any sight graduations on the left side, okay, at all. Typically, though, with Dragoon rifles, you will see those sight graduations on the right because most Dragoons that we have that are still around today came from Finland. And not all, but a lot of Dragoons from Finland, they re-stamped the sight graduations on the other side. But I digress, because this is actually not even the original rear sight on this gun. This sight came around was invented by an engineer at the Sistrayets factory named Kanovalov, but that wasn't until after the adaptation of the Spitzer cartridge, again, because much like the recoil lug, the Spitzer cartridge came first. And then as a result of the new cartridge, the stock started cracking, and then the old sights weren't working. The guns weren't hitting where they were supposed to. So they replaced the old sights with this Kanovalov rear sight. But what does one of those old sights look like? Well, I've got a real treat for you, because the original sights on these Dragoon rifles are extremely, extremely rare. But I have one today to take a look at. And this one's actually really cool because, let me see if I can zoom in on it, or if I need to hold it. This one is actually an Izhevsk produced rear sight. Do you see the bow and arrow right there? It's right there. Kind of hard to see. Maybe get in the light a little bit better. There it is. See that? And I'll flip it around so you can see it again. It's right there. This is an original Mosin style, what we would call a flat rear sight. So it's pretty simple. It's even simpler than the Kanovalov rear sight. The Kanovalov's a better design. It's curved. It's got these really nice fine graduations here that you can lock into. See these cutouts right there? And it comes out over the sides of the sight base, gives it a little bit more reinforcement. This guy, not so much. This was a pretty flimsy sight. You would have a lot of wobble back and forth like that with these sights, because the only thing holding it in was that pin. Not the greatest design in the world, but you'd have your aperture notch back here. Then you'd have your slider, of course, with different factory markings. Now, some of these you can find with pretty much all the early factory markings. Izhevsk, Tula, Sistrayetsk, and the Châtellerault factory in France. But on these Dragoon rifles, really the only applicable one are going to be the Izhevsk marked sights, because remember, when these sights were in before 1908, the only factory making the Dragoon rifles with these sights would have been the Izhevsk factory. Okay, so this may actually be an original Dragoon sight. Well, this one is probably, oh, this one's interesting. It's got see that Y there? That might mean this one was for training purposes. Well, you can see here on the back, because what would happen is if you needed to use a volley sight for really long distances, you'd flip it up like that. Then on the back here, you have these graduations. See, these are going to be in arshins. So if you were shooting around 1,300 arshins, that's when you'd flip up the volley sight. This guy would go all the way up to 2,700 arshins. That's very optimistic. But, you know, it was probably done a few times, and then after that, they realized that's pretty useless. You can't really hit anything at that distance. But when the Dragoon was introduced, it had this rear sight. So this is kind of cool. We have the original Dragoon rear sight. We've got the most common Dragoon rear sight, the Kanovalov sight. Then we've got the 9130 sight. So all three sights there. Pretty cool. And, of course, this one is also an Izhevsk, which makes sense. This is a Dragoon rifle. Now, on these Dragoon rifles with the Kanovalov rear sight, though, these can be mix and matched because, well, a lot of the time, these can be replaced with probably any sort of rear sight. So you might have, I mean, even New England Westinghouse rear sights on Dragoon rifles, because these are basically the same rear sights on the M91 rifles. So you can have a lot more variety when it comes to that, but not so much with these. Now these ones, why are these so rare? Well, that's kind of reasons you don't have any varieties, because they're so rare. Although probably if you had like a Tula, like we've looked at here before on the channel of one of these, you could probably put it on a Dragoon rifle, but you wouldn't want to do that, right? So what's interesting with this one is we could put this rear sight on this Dragoon rifle. You could. I could pop this guy out and just pop this guy on. But we don't really want to do that. And the main reason is because, I guess, these are so rare, okay? These sights do not work with modern ammunition. These sights only work with these weird old bottlenose shaped cartridges with really long, it kind of looks like an old 6.5 Carcano cartridge, that weird long bottlenose bullet. Not good, okay? Nobody still shoots that type of bullet in Mosin Nagant rifles. You could, because they didn't modify the chambers or anything like that, or bolts or really anything, besides the sight for the new cartridge. But so you could shoot an old cartridge in a Mosin, but why would you? You'd have to reload it, and that would be pretty strange. So not really something done, but just for looks, if you wanted to, you could put this rear sight back on an old rifle like this. It wouldn't be correct on this one again, though, because this one's been modified by Finland. And Finland definitely would not have had a sight like this on a infantry-issued rifle, because it doesn't work with the ammo they have. Now, Finland did have a number of old guns, and we'll talk about this another day, but they had a number of old guns after the Finnish Civil War that were left behind, probably in Russian armories with these old-style rear sights. Finland yeeted basically all of those. Not all of them, but basically all of them. So even though Finland was a great resource for getting a lot of cool Mosins, the sights not so much, because even they had really no use for these things. These were mostly probably just melted down for scrap metal. Kind of sad, but hey, we got one to look at, so that's pretty cool. So that was the sight. And again, that would have been from 1893 all the way up until around 1908, 1909. Dragoons would have had this sight. And even in World War I, some of these lingered around still because, well, not every single Mosin out of the millions that have produced by World War I had this modification done to it by the time war was declared. So you would run into some unfortunate situations, especially in the Balkan regions, where troops, some even Serbian troops, were reported to have this issue, where they had Mosins with this rear sight and Spitzer ammo, or vice versa even. That's a recipe for disaster. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting rabbit holes we could go down, but recap. What are the important things to know about an old Dragoon rifle? Had the escutcheons, although this one's missing one on this side, did not have the recoil lug in 1893 or 1895 when this guy was produced. Had this weird handguard that wrapped around the back here and had the sight graduations on the handguard itself. Had these barrel bands. Now this one's cool. These are real Dragoon barrel bands, and Dragoons do have sort of distinct barrel bands, but these were used across 3 different models. The 1907 carbine, the Dragoon rifle, and the Cossack rifle. But these are all interesting. They're one-piece barrel bands. It's just one piece of steel just wrapped around itself, essentially. Okay? You can see there's no distinction here between the 2 pieces like we would see on this 9130 rifle. See how that's actually 2 pieces separated there? It's basically a sprang. Well, these guys are older and they're one piece. So if you have a Dragoon rifle, a 1907 carbine rifle, or a Cossack rifle, these are going to be the correct type of barrel bands for that rifle. It's just one piece. These are relatively uncommon, but you can still get these, unlike the rear sight. You can still get these. So if you have a Dragoon rifle, be on the lookout for these, because these would be a cool addition to your rifle if it doesn't already have it. And this rear sight up here is also not correct for the original Dragoon variant from 1893. This one's taller. Now see this notch right here? The little notch there? That's an indication this is a Finnish Aimo Lahti designed modified front sight. And this brings us to another point we haven't talked about yet, which is, of course, the bayonet. So why did Finland modify the front sight on, well, Dragoons and really all other M91 rifles and such that they had lying around? That's because Dragoon rifles are sighted from the factory, even back in 1893, with the bayonet affixed to the end of the rifle. Okay, now why is that important? Well, that's important because when you affix a bayonet to the end of a rifle, it's going to change the point of impact when you're firing. So if you're aiming there with a bayonet, it might hit there without a bayonet or something like that. It gets really weird. Okay, well, Finland had a problem with this, and again, we'll talk about Finland in another episode, but that's why they replaced the front sights, because Finland did not like shooting guns with the bayonet affixed. That's really just not the greatest idea, especially if you're so accuracy-focused from a doctrine perspective like Finland was. They put taller front sights on these, cut an extra notch here to even shorten the minimum sighting distance from 400 arshins to around 200 meters, and then they called it a day, essentially. Pretty cool. But now what I want to do is take a look at the bayonets that these guns used, and then compare them to the bayonets the 9130 rifles over here used. One of these you've probably seen, and one of them, well, maybe you haven't seen yet. So I'm going to slide down here, and now we're going to take a closer look. So the bayonet closest to you is a 9130 bayonet. You've probably seen many bayonets just like this. These guys, the way they work is they have this little button right here, this little plunger, and you press that, and it slides onto the front sight base, which goes on there, and it locks the sight base in, so you can't then rotate it back out again. If you want to rotate it, then twist it off, you have to depress the button. Okay, now this is interesting because this was actually really a big problematic design, especially in World War II, because they kept losing their bayonets. They had such a high attrition rate of bayonets that I think in some areas of battlefields it was reported that they had over 90% of their bayonets missing. Now maybe I'm misunderstanding that statistic that I read, but it seems to be that these were lost in extremely high volumes. Now this is a problem for a few reasons. One, you're spending all the resources to make thousands of these, and then you're all just like losing them and having to replace them. That's really costly in wartime. These take resources, extra resources to replace. You don't want to have to do that. The bigger issue here is that, like the Dragoon rifle I just mentioned, the 9130 rifles are also sighted with a bayonet affixed to the rifle. So what happens if you lose your bayonet? Your gun's not going to hit where you're pointing it. Okay, so this is actually what's led to the M44 carbine with that fixed to the rifle folding bayonet. That's going down another rabbit hole. Why do I bring this up? Well, it's interesting because for that particular issue, the Dragoon bayonets were actually kind of a better design, sort of. Now, what we have here is, in fact, a bayonet that could have been used on a Dragoon rifle. Now, when I say could have, I don't say would have. Why is that? Well, it's really because there's not big differences between the Dragoon bayonets and the M91 bayonets. They basically look the same. Now, this one could be a Dragoon bayonet because we have our Ijevsk, see right there, our Ijevsk bow and arrow. So this could have been on a Dragoon rifle or just a standard M91 rifle. And we don't know if this one was produced during World War I or before. Chances are during World War I, just because the Ijevsk factory didn't make as many rifles as a whole as somebody like the Tula factory. And the Ijevsk factory made the majority of their rifles, I guess statistically, at least the stuff we have still around, probably during World War I. So it's fair to say this was produced at some point during World War I. This is probably for an M91 rifle, again, statistically, but we can't say for certain. Certainly will work on a Dragoon, but how does this work? Well, what happens is we slide the front sight base over this guy, and then we twist it, but then it can't go on more, because see, they have this locking ring in place. So to get it on, you twist the locking ring up like that. So see how the locking ring's hollow there? So you push your sight base through that, and then now your sight base is going to be right here where my finger is. This is my thumb finger. Where my thumb finger is, this hole right here. And then you turn the locking ring behind the sight base to lock it on. Really simple. Well, there's no button to depress here. Instead, there's a tension fitted screw. So you just turn this screw and then it tensions the locking lever here to where, well, now it's on there, and that rascal probably ain't coming off very easily. So if you had that really tight, to take this off, you'd really need to either just beat this with a hammer, which you really wouldn't want to do, or you just take a screwdriver and turn this, and then you could pull it off of your rifle. A lot harder and more of a pain to take off of your rifle compared to something like this 9130 bayonet. You can probably see why these were lost, and I don't have any tangible data from World War I bayonet attrition rates for the Russian army, but I'd be willing to bet a frog's belly hair that these bayonets were lost at a lower rate than these bayonets were lost. It just seems very logical to me, because it's a lot harder to get one of these rascals off once you have it secured than it is one of these rascals. Now, is this a better design? I don't think I could say that. I mean, it really depends on what it is we're talking about here. But from just the standpoint of once it's on the rifle, you don't want it off, this actually may be a better design, especially if, in the context of that I can speak to, of you need the bayonet affixed to the rifle if you want it to shoot where you're aiming. So, in that respect, maybe this is a better design, you know? But if you're wanting to take it off, take it back on, this is a better design, but you don't really want to be doing that if you need this apparatus in order to shoot where you're aiming, right? That just seems very logical to me. But that's our main differences here. As we can see, the length is about the same here overall. And some of y'all might remember we just did a giveaway where we actually gave away an interesting bayonet of this style. Oh, that one was actually shortened. It's a little bit shorter, so a little bit more compact. You don't really realize how long one of these bayonets is. I mean, this is like the opening credits to Star Wars. This thing just keeps going and going and going and going and going and going. I mean, imagine getting run through by one of these bayonets. I mean, you could probably run 2 or 3 guys through back to back with one of these. It's just, it's not good. Of course, this makes your gun a lot longer, which is a problem. But thankfully, the Dragoon rifles are a little bit shorter than those even longer M91 rifles that we see as the mainstay of the Russian army in World War I. So, is this actually a carbine? Well, I think I referred to this earlier as a carbine, and I'm kind of hesitant to actually refer this to as a carbine. When I said carbine, I was really meaning in relation to the M91 rifle. This is sort of a carbine because it's shorter, but this is the same length as a 9130 rifle. And would we call this big old rifle a carbine? Probably not, because we have the context of having the M38 and the M44 carbines, so we'd say, no, this isn't a carbine. But remember, it's all about context. If all you had was that really long M91 rifle, you might call this one a carbine, because it's comparatively shorter. So, see, it's all relative, right? That could be another 1-hour rant for another day. What is a carbine? Is your definition of a carbine different than mine? It actually may be, but see, I think there's an absolute term for a carbine, and there's definitely relative comparisons for carbines, but let's face it, we're probably all going to have different opinions on the matters. Okay, so recap. We looked at our Dragoon rifle. We now know what a Dragoon rifle is, except for the fact we haven't really talked about what the word Dragoon implies, okay? And I'm going to be a little careful with how I define this, because as we're going to look at later throughout this week, we're going to see that it wasn't just Dragoons that used these rifles. But what is a Dragoon? Well, a Dragoon is essentially a really old term, even going back to like Napoleonic eras, talking about essentially mounted infantry. You would have troops, they were on horseback, so sort of like cavalry, except they would basically ride to the battlefield on their horses. Then they would dismount and then march to the battlefield, like the front line, essentially. That's a very, very high-level, stereotypical overview of what a Dragoon is. But you can kind of think of it as horse-mounted infantry. Now, the Dragoons, it seems a lot of times you'll see didn't have the bayonet affixed to the rifle. So it seems like Dragoons actually, much more than infantry, did a lot of this fastening and unfastening of the bayonet. Why is that? Well, a lot of the pictures we see of Dragoons on horseback, we see that rifle is slung across their back with no bayonet on. But why? Because you need the bayonet to shoot right. Well, what you'll see on a lot of those pictures is they'll also have cavalry sabers. This is one of the reasons these guns are so cool, is because back when these guys were produced, this was a very old world doctrine. You would still have good old-fashioned cavalry charges. Now, not always into machine guns like we kind of think of sometimes, but a lot of times you'd have cavalry on cavalry charges, or, cavalry, going about like flanking maneuvers or reconnaissance missions or things like that. But you definitely have cavalry charges. Well, they would have sabers, big swords, kind of like we would see used in the American Civil War. okay? And it's really the same tactics, except they had Mosins now. Really, really weird. So they had these old-fashioned Napoleonic / American Civil War tactics with guys with sabers. But what you'll notice on the pictures is their sabers will be in a scabbard. And on the side of the scabbard, outside of the scabbard, there'll be little holders where the Mosin bayonet would fit on the side of the scabbard. So it seems like when these guys were just like running about on horseback, their bayonet would be on the side of their scabbard, and then when it's time to get off, dismount, march into the battlefield, they would remove the bayonet from the side of their scabbard, and then affix it to the rifle, and then march into battle that way. Again, not all did this, but seems to be that was generally the case for a lot of these guys that had, that were actual what we would call today Dragoon troops on horseback. Really fascinating piece of history. So these guns really are two different things altogether, right? If we can kind of sum up the differences between a Dragoon rifle and a 9130 rifle, you could think of this as the gun where we go back to enemy at the gates. Remember the assault at Stalingrad when they're giving these guns to like every other guy, and then every other guy just doesn't get a gun to the masses. This is sort of like the Mosin of the masses, right? Now, that's one way to look at 9130 rifles that were produced during the war, because these were made in the millions, and these really were the guns that helped save the world from the terrible Nazis. But that's a story for another day. That's our World War II Mosin. The Dragoon rifle looks very similar, except this was used by people in much older tactics. Instead of like, you know, door-to-door fighting at Stalingrad, where people used the 9130 rifle, these would have been used by like Napoleonic-era cavalry troops. All right? And a lot of these guys even had lances, which we'll have to talk about here later this week. Just really fascinating stuff, and just a lost part of history. To me, this is really that interesting era where two eras collide. One era was ending with these old-style cavalry charges, and a new era was beginning with machine guns and, you know, modern artillery and weapons. And they collided at this time with these Dragoon troops who had Mosins. That's pretty cool, folks. So I hope you all enjoyed taking a closer look at Mosins. Again, this has been an introduction to the Dragoon rifle. We're going to be looking at more Dragoon rifles throughout the week and doing a lot more cool stuff with these guys. So if you're interested, please subscribe and stay tuned for more Dragoon madness. So until next time, guys, thanks for watching. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.